This is a production of Cornell University.
Welcome to the Center for the Study of Economy and Society's lecture series. I'm very pleased to introduce this afternoon James Robinson, the David Florence Professor of Government at Harvard, to a Cornell audience. A distinguished scholar of Latin America and Africa, Jim Robinson was educated at the London School of Economics and Yale University, where he received his PhD in 1993. He co-authored with Darren Acemoglu the much-acclaimed book, Economic Origin of Dictatorship and Democracy, and many influential articles published on political economy in the American Economic Review, the Quarterly Journal of Economics, the American Political Science Review, the Journal of Political Economy. The range of topics covered in the long list of distinguished publications addresses many of the consequential issues and problems in political economy. For example, what were the consequences of radical reform in the French Revolution? The problem of the missing middle class in Russia, the question of why Africa is poor, power elites and institutions and why they persist, the economic origins of democracy, the rise of Europe, the causes of economic backwardness, a theory of political transition. Giving you an example of the style of work, one of the most cited of the articles in this long list is one which examines the mortality rates of Europeans in their different colonies, showing that where Europeans experienced high mortality and could not settle, they put in place extractive political and economic institutions, and that these institutions persist to the present day and are an important cause of economic backwardness in sub-Saharan Africa and countries near the equator. The underlying theme of Jim Robinson's research program is contained in his lecture today and the most recent book, Why Nations Fail, which is the topic of the lecture today. After the lecture, there will be a reception upstairs, just on the third floor with refreshments, and you'll have a chance to talk with them there. Thank you.
Thank you. Is this switched on now? Do I? Okay. Can everyone hear me? Yes. Okay. Thanks. Thank you very. Maybe I hadn't switched it on. Where is that?
Yeah, you got it. How's that?
Is that better? Yes. Okay. Great. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Victor, for that very generous introduction. And I'm very happy to be very happy and honoured to be here presenting today. What I'm going to talk about, as Victor said, is I'm going to talk about this, try to give an overview in 45-50 minutes of this new book that Darren Acemoglu and I wrote, Why Nations Fail. And let me just sort of, before I kind of dive into this, let me say, this book is an attempt to put together in a simple way a lot of the academic papers that we've been writing over the last 15 years. So we wanted to try to distill, in some sense, in a framework which is as simple as we could make it, what we thought we'd sort of learnt from all of this academic work. I think, when you do academic research, whether it's kind of theoretical modelling, mathematical modelling, or econometrics, you tend to be focused on very kind of specific hypotheses or different mechanisms, and so this was an attempt to sort of try to put the collectivity together in a way which we thought would be sort of appealing and fun. So it's an enterprise which is very different from most of our work, including the earlier book which Victor mentioned, which was a much more kind of technically driven enterprise. So I say that with some trepidation. I'll begin. Okay, so where does this? What's this book about? Well, this book is about, in some sense, it's about this first slide. This is data. This is historical. This is sort of rather fuzzy data estimates of historical levels of income per capita from the work of Angus Maddison. And there's sort of two things I want to point out in this picture, which the book is about. It's about large differences in income per capita today. So there's very large differences between income levels in poor parts of the world, sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and parts of East Asia, and more affluent countries, Western Europe, North America. So the aim of the book, in some sense, is to develop a simple framework for thinking about what generates those differences, and to advance, to sort of anticipate the main theme. It's a sort of very institutional type explanation. So it's an explanation which draws inspiration from a great deal of work in economics and economic history and political science and indeed sociology on how institutions shape incentives and economic prosperity. So I guess if you'd say who was the person that we've been most influenced by, it would be Doug North. So we're going to propose an institutional explanation of these differences, and we're also very interested in these historical dynamics as well. So most of our work has been trying to understand not just these differences today, but how they emerged historically. Why was it that some countries developed different institutions in the early modern and modern period? Why did they experience much more rapid economic growth than other parts of the world? And why are we interested in this historical stuff? Well, I think we've always found that the historical stuff is sort of fascinating, but it's also very powerful as a way of discriminating between different types of explanations. So we've used kind of historical examples and historical data for both, for this purpose of, there's a lot more variation in history, and it's given us a way of trying to discriminate between different hypotheses. That being said, I'm not going to talk very much about different hypotheses at all. What I'm just going to try to do today is just develop the kind of main framework and apply it that we use in the book. The book has some discussion of course, there's many different interpretations of this. You could say, this differences in income per capita today are driven by geography. Sub-Saharan Africa is poor because it's in the tropics and it's hot and there's malaria. Or you could give some sort of cultural argument about how Northern Europe, and the United States and Canada are economically successful because there's some sort of unique Anglo-Saxon, culture or something like that makes people work hard and makes them entrepreneurial and save, and So in the book we sort of discuss these alternative hypotheses. I'm not going to get into that too much today. Now and then I may make a sort of snide remark about some alternative hypothesis, but I'm not going to kind of evaluate them in any systematic way. I just want to try to give you the sort of the main vision of the book. Okay, so before I, kind of explain this institutional theory and the building blocks in more detail, I want to motivate it with a kind of empirical and historical example. Okay, so before I talk about definitions, I want to tell you a story about the economic and political history of the Americas and about this divergence in prosperity historically within the Americas between North America and South America, and then I'm going to use that sort of story to abstract the kind of key building blocks of the theory. Okay? So why the Americas? Why start by talking about the Americas? And in particular, I'm going to talk about the impact of European colonization on the Americas, on the organization of society in South America and in North America, and how that created economic divergence. Well, why do I do that? Well, I think because it's not that America was a tabula rasa at the point of European colonial expansion in the late 15th or 16th centuries, but I think the Americas reveals sort of very starkly a lot of the forces at work which we think are important for understanding the general issues. If I was going to talk about sub-Saharan Africa or other parts of the world, that would be much more complicated, I think. So that's why we like the Americas. And I guess, in some sense, the people who first understood, how powerful this American experience was for thinking about what drives long-run patterns of comparative development were the economic historians Stan Engerman and Ken Sokolov. So we also owe, for anyone who knows our academic work, you'll know that we also owe a lot to the intellectual tradition that they started. Okay, so enough of that. So let me tell you about European colonization in South America and North America. Europeans started colonizing the Americas with very similar intentions. Okay, their intentions were to, to make money, let's say, and to accumulate power and wealth or whatever. When the Spaniards first started colonizing the continent in 1519, when Cortés landed in Mexico, this was a very similar pattern which happened in many places. So there was an early kind of military struggle for power, which the Spanish won, and then the Spanish created a colonial society. Okay? And what did that colonial society look like? Well, after Cortés defeated the Mexicas in the early 1520s, the first thing he did was he took all the indigenous people and he divided them up into what's called encomiendas. And an encomienda was a sort of grant of indigenous people to a Spanish conquistador. So the society got formed on the basis of there was a very steep hierarchy between Spaniards and the indigenous people, and indigenous people were there to provide services, tribute, coerced labor for the conquistadors. Okay? One of the nicest examples of how important this motivation of the exploitation of indigenous people comes from the history of Buenos Aires. So nowadays, if any of you have been to Buenos Aires, the Pampa, this is thought of as being a very kind of sophisticated place, all this wonderful productive land. It's interesting to read about the history of Buenos Aires, because Buenos Aires was, when it was first founded, what's now the Pampa was not the basis for any dense indigenous population. In fact, the people who were living in the Pampa were more or less, non-sedentary hunter-gatherers. And these were, they ran about, they fired arrows at the Spanish. The Spanish sent out expeditions, and they discovered inland, up in what's now Paraguay, the Guarani. And the Guarani were a densely populated, settled agrarian society with hierarchy and tribute. The Spanish immediately abandoned Buenos Aires, moved up the river, and took over the Guarani society. Okay? So the basis, in some sense, of the type of kind of organization of Latin American society, which is sort of crucial for understanding their long-run development, is in this, and I'll try to identify some key properties of that organization which we think is important, is in this early construction of this very hierarchical, unequal colonial society based on the exploitation of indigenous people. So what's happened in the United States? Well, the colonization of the United States, you could say there's early fits and starts, but it gets going in earnest in 1607 with the creation of the Jamestown colony in Virginia. So what was the idea in Jamestown? The idea in Jamestown was exactly the same as the idea in Mexico or Buenos Aires or Bogota or wherever it was. The idea was to make money. The Virginia Company was a money-making enterprise, and it was there to make money through trade, through exploitation, whatever. Okay? And in fact, they explicitly had a model for how you colonized. The first thing you did was you captured the Indian chief, because what did Cortés do? Cortés captured Montezuma. Pizarro captured Atahualpa in Peru. Once you captured the indigenous leader, then that gave you a very powerful instrument for extracting tribute, for getting control over this society. So their idea was the same thing. There was a gentleman called Wahun Sunakok who was the local leader, but he was a very different sort of leader than Montezuma or Atahualpa. He was ruling over this loose confederation of tribes. He didn't have the same mechanisms. This was not a hierarchical, relatively bureaucratized state like the Inca state or the state of the Mexicas. This was something completely different. Okay? This was much more like the initial conditions in the Pampa than it was in Paraguay or in Peru. So the second winter of the Virginia colony, of the Jamestown colony, 2/3 of the people starved to death. Why was that? Because they didn't bother planting any crops. That's crazy. Why didn't they plant crops? Because that's not how you colonize the Americas. You didn't work. You exploited the indigenous people. But the indigenous people turned out to be very difficult to exploit in Virginia. So the Virginia Company wasn't happy with this. They were there to make money. So they said, okay, so that didn't work. Let's try exploiting the British people. Okay? So then they switched their strategy and they introduced this draconian regime into Jamestown. And here's some of the laws they propagated. And the first law is very interesting. No man or woman shall run away from the colony to the Indians upon pain of death. So that's significant, of course, because the immediate reaction of an Englishman to being, or English woman, they were mostly men, to being exploited was to run off and live with, to live with the indigenous people. My father, who was for most of his life was a colonial official, you know, this used to be described as going native by British colonial officials. So the British ran away. It was also, there's an element here which is more difficult to sort of conceptualize, which was that it was more difficult to exploit an English person than an indigenous person, because English people could appeal to some sort of nebulous rights and they could talk about the Magna Carta or something like that. Also, it became clear that, if you want to develop a colony by having English people do the work, you had to get more English people to come. And that was very difficult if you were exploiting egregiously the ones who were already there. So in 1619, so this didn't work very well. In 1619, and this is a sort of very important moment, the Virginia Company abandoned this and said, let's do something completely different. Let's try to give people incentives. So they freed people from their labour contracts. A lot of these people who were there were indentured labourers. They gave up the fiction that all the land was owned by the Virginia Company. They started giving people land. They gave people 50 acres. You got another 50 acres for every person you brought. If you could bring more people from England, you got more land. And to back up this change in the way the economy was organised, they introduced a General Assembly in 1619. So there's some debate amongst historians about what the franchise of this thing was. But the consensus opinion seems to be this basically enfranchised adult males. So this was not the transplantation of some wonderful British institution. British males didn't have universal suffrage until 300 years later. So this was, this was an institutional kind of innovation to make this colony work. And both economic institutions and political institutions evolved in a way which was very different from in Latin America. These same struggles that I described went on in other colonies, in Maryland, in the Carolinas, where they also, the original plan was to set up a kind of hierarchical proprietary colony, which then collapsed under similar forces. Okay, so in some sense, the historical origins of the divergence between North and South America, actually, if you think about it, it's even more stark than divergence. It's actually what we called in a paper reversal, because if you thought about the part of the Americas in 1492, which were more advanced economically than, it would have been the Central Valley of Mexico, it would have been Andean Peru or Bolivia, not the southern cone of Latin America or North America. They were much behind technologically and in terms of political development. So that completely flipped around. Okay? So that's interesting for thinking about, whether there's a kind of enduring impact of geography on comparative development, for instance. So this is the origin of massive inequality, absence of democracy, etc. in Latin America. And it's the origin of a very different type of society in North America. Well, that happened a long time ago. So how is that relevant for talking about today? Well, in the first chapter, we sort of describe these origins, and then we try to describe the very path-dependent way that institutions evolved over time. Let me just give you one example of what I mean by that. In the 19th century, world trade expanded, transportation costs fell. Suddenly, all of this land, frontier land in the Americas, was valuable. Of course, the United States had a famous frontier. But most Latin American countries, except El Salvador, had a frontier as well. Not only that, they had frontier myths. You go to Colombia, Colombians have frontier myths. They had a frontier, they had frontier expansion. Chile had frontier expansion. Argentina had frontier expansion. Guatemala had frontier expansion. What's the difference between frontier expansion in Guatemala and the United States? It's how the frontier land was allocated. So in the United States, you had, going back to the Northwest Ordinances in the late 18th century through to the Homestead Act in 1862, you had this relatively egalitarian allocation of the frontier land. What you had in Latin America, outside Costa Rica, was a very inegalitarian, oligarchic frontier expansion. So that's very much part of a kind of path-dependent process in the sense that it reinforces the initial conditions. So why did you have those differences? You had those differences because US society was much more politically open and democratic than Latin American society. That's something that has its roots back in the colonial period. So that meant it was very difficult to set up an oligarchic allocation of land in the US. It was just too democratic and politically competitive for that. But you can see how that reinforces this path. So if you start with a broad distribution of political power, then you have this economic opportunity that influences how it's allocated. If land gets allocated in a relatively egalitarian way, that tends to reproduce the initial political conditions that generated that outcome. Whereas in Latin America, you have very different initial conditions, similarly reinforcing themselves in the way they led to this very inegalitarian allocation of land. Okay, so that's just an example of the path that we try to describe in the book, leading from the past to today. This is from some research by a student of mine in Daron, Melissa Adele, who's now assistant professor at Harvard. Melissa did something, more specific than just look at the path. She looked at the imprint of the most important institution of forced labor in colonial Latin America, which was the Potosí Mita. So the Potosí Mita was this huge system of forced labor which was used to mobilize indigenous workers for the silver mines in Potosí in Bolivia. So there's this huge catchment area that went through the kind of altiplano of Bolivia and Peru. And what Melissa did was, Melissa looked, so this was abolished in 1825, the Mita. Melissa looked at the boundary, places on the boundary today, and she compared places just inside the Mita to just outside the Mita. And what you see from this is you see places just inside the Mita compared to outside the Mita have 1/3 less household consumption. They have much less involvement in market activity, so people are much more involved in subsistence agriculture, much lower density of infrastructure, less educational attainment. So you see the imprint of these institutions even today. I'd say, if you get off the plane in La Paz, you don't expect to see, peons and, serfs, etc., But the world changes, but the world changes in a very path-dependent way, and that's the story we try to tell here. So let me try to abstract some principles from this, okay? So let me just introduce some terminology which you're going to find, embarrassingly simplistic and crude, but we thought that this dichotomy I'm going to introduce is just a very useful way for trying to kind of organize thinking on this topic. Okay, so let me use the following language. The type of economic institutions that you see in colonial Latin America, we're going to call those extractive economic institutions. And what we see in North America, we're going to call this inclusive economic institutions. Why inclusive? What's important about inclusive? Well, let me give you another historical example. This comes also from the work of Ken Sokolov. So what Ken did was he studied the social origins of patentees in the United States for the 19th century. And what he showed was that if you look at, even you could restrict attention to sort of famous inventors, like Edison or Eli Whitney or something like that. What you see is that people come from all over the social spectrum. Poor people, rich people, farmers, artisans, elites, non-elites, professional people. So we know as economists, since the work of Robert Solow in the 1950s, that what drives long-run economic growth is technical change, innovation, new products, new ideas, new ways of doing things. What drives that? Why did the United States become the world's technology leader in the 19th century? Because it had a set of economic institutions that gave incentives and opportunities to kind of mobilize all these talents and ideas and skills which were spread out very broadly in society. I learned today, hanging out with sociologists, that it was a Schumpeter. This all comes from Schumpeter. Anyway, this was the key. And why wouldn't you have that in Latin America? Because these institutions of coerced labor, of discrimination and the legal system, political exclusion, they excluded the vast mass of people from having incentives or economic opportunities. The best so I always find, like, to illustrate this notion of extractive economic institutions, the most powerful example that really gets the idea across is apartheid South Africa. Okay? What was apartheid South Africa? Apartheid South Africa was a sort of system of economic institutions designed to extract income from black people and 80% of the population that were black and redistribute it to 20% of the population who were white. What were those economic institutions? Well, let me give you some examples. In 1913, the South African government passed what's called the Native Land Act, which basically said 7% of the country is land which is for black people, that's 80% of the population, and the whites get the other 93%. That was the white economy. In the white economy, black people were not allowed to own assets, own land, houses. They were not allowed to start a business. There was, in the 1920s, they introduced something called the colour bar. The colour bar was a huge list of occupations which only white people could have. Lawyers, doctors, brickmakers, bakers, artisans, any skilled profession or profession, only white people could do that. Why on earth have that? That's completely crazy. Any economist will tell you this leads to an enormously inefficient allocation of resources. You can't have what went on, what Sokolov described in 19th century US in such a society. But that did generate enormous rents in the labour market for white people, for white skilled workers, and it generated a huge supply of unskilled black workers for the mines and the farms. So it's not surprising that South Africa has a level of inequality which is similar to a Latin American country, because the origins of that society are very similar. And by the way, this is one of my snide remarks, just to flag the snide remarks about alternative hypotheses. South Africa and Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, were started by English people, not Spanish people. Okay, so what we're going to see later when I give some more contemporary examples, there's many ways you can be extractive and inclusive. Okay? If you look at the particular institutions of a society, they're going to differ in many different ways. Okay? But the argument of the book is sort of, we can use this common lens to think about what the consequences of these institutions for the economy and what motivates them. Okay? So thinking about what motivates them, let's go back to thinking about why countries have extractive or inclusive. How come the US ended up with these inclusive economic institutions? Or how come, Colombia ended up with these extractive economic institutions? And that's where the next kind of layer of this comes in here. And that's about politics. Okay? So at some level, what I'm describing so far, would be very kind of non-controversial. Like any economist understands, economic theory is all about incentives. And, you learn very early on in economics how different types of systems, different types of economic institutions create different incentives, and that has important consequences for prosperity. But just how come the world got organized like this? How come in South Africa a set of economic institutions got set up which benefited 20% of the population at the expense of the rest of the population? That's all to do with politics. That's all to do with the fact that the whites in South Africa had political power. They had the guns and they had the political institutions which are rigged in their favor. And the same is true in the Americas. So lying behind these sets of economic institutions which are absolutely crucial for incentives and opportunities and technical change and long-run economic growth are like political institutions. So most of the focus in the book is really about these differences in political institutions and why political institutions, what generates the dynamics of political institutions and variation in political institutions. And we use the same terminology. So we want to say, lying behind extractive economic institutions or extractive political institutions, and lying behind inclusive economic institutions are inclusive political institutions. So what are inclusive political institutions? We emphasize two things. The first thing, which should be obvious from my discussion of the origins of the Homestead Act or something, is we emphasize, a broad distribution of political power. So the language that a political scientist, like Robert Dahl would use to talk about this would be pluralistic distribution of political power. So there's a broad distribution of political power in society. This dichotomy is very stark. You're going to think, well, in reality, there's shades of grey. Hold on a second. Wasn't there slavery in the United States until 1865? Yes, there was, and the South was poorer, less industrialized, less innovative, less urbanization, less infrastructure compared to the North. The crucial thing is that the South was richer than it otherwise would have been because it was embedded in this much more functional set of institutions, which emerged prior to the development of the slave economy. You know, I'm going to talk about contingency later on. You know, there's nothing inevitable in history, I don't think. If the South, there's a very nice book by the economic historian Roger Ransom, which is about what would have happened if the US South had won the Civil War. And then the answer is that the United States would not be the world's richest country. It would be more like Brazil. So yeah, I'll come back to that later on. Okay, so there's these, the dichotomy is oversimplified, but we think it's useful. Okay, so let me come back to the politics. So broad distribution of political power. Okay, that's part of this notion of inclusive political institutions. The other thing we emphasize in the book, and I think this is very important for understanding lots of development problems in the world today, is what we call political centralization. So to have inclusive economic institutions, it's not enough to have a broad distribution of political power. You need to have an effective centralized state. So let me motivate that with an example, which is Somalia. Okay? So the most famous ethnography of the Somali clans in East Africa is by a Welsh social anthropologist called Ioan Lewis. And the book is called A Pastoral Democracy. And the title is very significant because if you read Lewis's discussion of the political institutions of the Somali, what he found was that, and this is actually true of many pre-colonial societies in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, that they had a very democratic way of making decisions. Adult males, not women, just like in 1619 colonial Virginia, unfortunately, adult males in Somali clans collectively made decisions. It was a very democratic situation, but there was absolutely no state in Somalia. This was almost an acephalous society. There were sultans who kind of mediated disputes and could negotiate or arbitrate, but they actually had no power to do anything. They couldn't punish anyone, they couldn't tell anybody to do anything. So this situation of very broad distribution of political power in the absence of a state didn't create inclusive economic institutions, it created kind of anarchy. Most of Lewis's book is taken up with long descriptions of blood feuds and murders and retaliation, and so it's these two things we want to emphasize today. And when I come to talk a little bit about countries in the world today and the difference between poor and rich countries, I'm going to say, of course, that the problem in poor countries that they have these extractive institutions. Extractive institutions vary in different ways. In some places, the problem is this lack of political centralization. In other places, there might be a quite centralized state, quite effective state, but there isn't a broad distribution of political power. So if either of these two things fail, we say there's extractive political institutions. So let me use a little diagram which was suggested to us by Elhanan Helpman, the great international trade economist, which I love very much, but our editor wouldn't have this in the book. He said, no, much too complicated. But I'm not going to insult your intelligence by not talking about this. I find this diagram very helpful. So here's the sort of story here. So in the book, we emphasize a lot this dichotomy between extractive economic institutions underpinned by extractive political institutions. And this little arrow here suggests that, as I already kind of alluded to, we think this is a very sort of stable situation. Up here is this combination of inclusive and inclusive political, inclusive economic. And the off-diagonals tend to be unstable. Okay? Go back to South Africa. South Africa has this extractive society. Political power is concentrated, within white people. Economic institutions are extractive in the sense that they're designed to redistribute income and wealth and assets and power, for that matter, from Africans to white people. In 1994, the political system opens, and suddenly black people get to vote. You can't have the colour bar anymore. Okay? You can't have all these restrictions on black people's occupation or their ability to start a firm or where they can live. Those institutions can't be sustained once you have this redistribution of political power. Okay? So that off diagonal is very unstable. So, for example, it's not that you don't have countries in these off diagonals. In fact, according to our framework, China would be a classic example of a country in this off diagonal. So, if you thought about the experience of Chinese economic growth since the 1970s, that's precisely been a movement from this box here into that box, in the sense that economic institutions, starting with this liberalization in agriculture in the late 1970s, the introduction of the household responsibility system, the introduction of incentives, generated huge productivity improvements. The Communist Party state started withdrawing from this attempt to control every aspect of life. That created this enormous boom in China, which has been going on ever since. What am I doing? Which has been going on ever since. So that creates this movement towards inclusive economic institutions, creates this boom. But what our theory suggests is that, well, you can't have inclusive economic institutions with extractive political institutions. That's just not, that's a transitory situation. There's plenty of examples in history of such situations. Okay? Argentina before the First World War was a very nice example of an economic expansion for 40 years with relatively inclusive economic institutions, but with a very with a very authoritarian political system, and which crashed. And so I guess here with respect, this is all I'm going to say about China. People maybe ask questions about it, but the emphasis here is on the fact that this type of growth here is not sustainable, which means you either have to go in that direction or you have to go in that direction. In the book, we give sort of very different sorts of historical examples of societies which have gone in different directions. Of course, the theory is not nearly sort of specific enough to make a prediction about that. And we just talk about what sort of factors might lead you to go in one direction as opposed to the other. If you'd read Victor's new book about China, Capitalism from Below, I think you'd be very optimistic that China was actually going to make a transition into the inclusive box because of his characterization of the nature of economic growth and the process that's gone on in China since the 1970s. Okay, so we use this framework to sort of think about both differences in the world today and these historical dynamics. So let me think a little about the historical dynamics. Okay, so in a sort of crude way, keeping in the spirit of having a crude framework, you could say that historically all societies were in this extractive box, cell of the matrix, and the emergence of modern world inequality, you can find societies in history that sort of moved out of it or, innovated economic or political institutions, experienced spells of economic growth or whatever. But the most interesting thing to think about, in the last 250 years, what the historian Kenneth Pomerantz called the Great Divergence, is in some sense, what causes this transition? What causes this great divergence is that some parts of the world make this transition towards more inclusive institutions. They make this transition out of this box into this box here. And at some level, world inequality is created by the British Industrial Revolution, as we know, and the fact that this, which itself was it's a great example of Solow's analysis, because the British Industrial Revolution was exactly a kind of whole series of cluster of innovations, of technological innovations, the use of inanimate power, steam power, technical innovations in use of metals, in textile production, using machinery, the invention of the factory system, organizational, technological innovation all over the place. But more than that, it was a sort of methodology which appeared. It wasn't just an isolated series of inventions. It was a sort of method of invention or an approach to innovation which then accumulated. That generated huge productivity improvements in some parts of the world, but it didn't spread to other parts of the world. Why was that? Well, that was because of the sort of the institutional map in some sense of the world. That Britain, and this is the sort of the way we discuss this in the book, through a series of, no, hold on, am I going in the right direction? I'm not going to talk about Liberia. Britain developed more inclusive institutions. And how did it do it? Okay, well, in the book we emphasize, you might think if I go back to that box, go back to that matrix, you're in the the cell of being sort of inclusive, extractive, and we're trying to understand, to have economic development or economic divergence, some countries have to get into this inclusive cell of the matrix. Okay, so the British case, that involves a series of political conflicts in the 17th century, the Civil War and the Glorious Revolution, which move the political system in a much more inclusive direction in both ways, both in the sense of making the central state much stronger and in terms of broadening the distribution of political power, and that leads to more inclusive economic institutions. So in the book we emphasize a lot that sort of causal channel leading from political change to economic change. Now, this discussion, brings in a kind of crucial part of the book that I haven't really mentioned sort of explicitly so far, which is conflict. There's a lot of conflict. This is a very kind of Machiavellian political economy way of thinking about the world, and there's clearly conflict over institutions. Okay, so if you think about here different groups using their power, their political power, in order to structure economic institutions in their favour, then that's going to create a lot of contestation and conflict over institutions. Okay, so that was true in 17th century Britain as much as it's true about about Syria or Egypt or Tunisia today, or about the French Revolution that Victor was talking about, or many other revolutions in Latin America, or indeed American history. Okay, so the dynamics of institutions, what we emphasize very much is that there's conflict over institutions, and certain instances which we use this language, what we call a critical juncture. Certain shocks to a society lead to a sort of redistribution of power, or an ability of some group to solve the collective action problem, contest power to try to change institutions, and that's a sort of moment where institutional change can take place. But of course there's no necessity that institutional change will take place in a way, if you're in a society with extractive institutions, there's no necessity that a conflict will lead to a society with inclusive institutions. The Bolshevik Revolution didn't lead to a society with inclusive institutions, it just led to a different type of extractive society. So that's something that sociologists, at least when I was an undergrad at the LSE, sociologists called the iron law of oligarchy. So the notion of the iron law of oligarchy is a sort of fundamental idea that, there's conflict and change in society, but a lot of it is just one elite replacing another elite. That's only one facet of what they were talking about. But that's, think of it in the Egyptian case, the Egyptian case today. So here, you have society solves a collective action problem. There's political change in the sense that the Mubarak regime and his cronies are out. What happens? Well, the army would like to recreate a Mubarak-type regime with a different figurehead on top. So then you wouldn't expect any real change. Or the Muslim Brotherhood could replace the army, on top of a different type of extractive institutions, in the same way the Bolsheviks replaced the Tsar. I'm not sure that anyone really compares the Bolsheviks to the Muslim Brotherhood, but you see the idea. Or you could have a transition to a very different type of society. So when would you expect that transition to occur? And the idea that we have in the book, is that depends on the nature, in some sense, of the groups that are contesting this conflict. So this is a very kind of empirical idea which we just extract from different cases. And the idea we emphasize is that what you need is this sort of what we call a broad coalition, which is that a very, what you see in the case of the Glorious Revolution, for example, in 1688 in Britain, is that the forces that were sort of pushing for institutional change were very heterogeneous in the sense where there were parliamentary elites, there were aristocrats, but there were many other people involved in that, merchants, different people in society. So we have the sense that that coalition is sort of crucial in the sense that once that coalition wins a conflict, then it's very difficult to, given that the instruments that you use, the mobilization strategies, it's very difficult for some subset of that to kind of recreate another extractive regime. So, this is much more like an empirical claim. We don't have a model of that, but we're working on it. Or we don't have what an economist would call a model of it. Okay, so there's a particular type of conflict which leads to this emergence of inclusive institutions in early modern Britain, and that spreads, unevenly in the world. Different countries like the United States came to inclusive institutions by different paths, in the same way I'm describing. Sub-Saharan Africa, experienced a long historical process of extractive institutions, which goes, back in history through pre-colonial state formation, the existence of different types of economic institutions, colonialism, etc. European powers, of course, like Britain, imposed extractive institutions on large parts of the world. Where did South Africa and Rhodesia came from? They came from, Britain and imposing extractive institutions on large parts of the world. So colonialism is also a big part of the story. I think if you think about institutional variation around the world today, it's very difficult for me to think about that without thinking about the consequences of European colonialism. But of course, that's only part of the story. There's lots of sources of variation in institutions. Okay, so let me not talk about that. Okay, so that's this sort of story about world inequality. So let me sort of skip on and talk about. I've given you this idea of like persistence. So we have lots of kind of historical examples of try to think about persistence, but I think the mechanisms of persistence of both inclusive and extractive are kind of clear. And this British case is an example, of what we call breaking the mold of sort of institutional transition. And of course, that's also, something particularly interesting. So if you were a sort of policy guru, at the World Bank or something, and you wanted to think about, how is this theory interesting for me? It would be, well, we should be thinking about these cases of transition, what creates transition, and, how could we facilitate transition? So if we think about the world today, though, if we think about, if we think about inequality today, then, this is about, variation in institutions. So we have one chapter where we sort of say why nations fail today, and the basic idea is that, we look at these very different types of societies. Zimbabwe, Sierra Leone, Uzbekistan, Colombia, Argentina, Egypt, North Korea. You might think, what on earth have those countries got in common? Well, according to this terminology, they all have extractive economic and political institutions. So these are very kind of coarse bins, so we're sort of sorting every society into one of these two bins. There are obviously lots of heterogeneity within any one of these bins, but we try to argue that, this is a way of thinking about the problems in all these places. So of course the details of extractive institutions in poor countries differ a lot. So here's an example from Zimbabwe. Some of you may not know this, but in the year 2000, President Mugabe, he's not only a powerful man, he's a very lucky man. He won the lottery in 2000. I like this example very much, because it's not like he needed the money. This is not about the money. This is about power. This is about projecting power, I think, and sort of showing, look, I can do anything I like in this country. I can even win the lottery if I want. Okay? Now, that's, here's another case which is very different. Uzbekistan. Uzbekistan is a country which, which has actually quite a strong, powerful central state because of its inheritance from the Soviet period, but it has immensely extractive institutions. That's manifested in many ways. One is via labor coercion. So, I don't know if any of you are, students, you come to school at Cornell in September, you're here to study and take classes and stuff. In Uzbekistan, what they do is they then ship you off to the cotton fields to pick cotton for 2 months when the cotton bolls ripen. So the whole school population, I don't know about college students, it's kids at school. They're more dexterous, perhaps, than professors and college students. Their teachers become labor recruiters, and school kids are shipped off to do forced labor picking cotton. That's only the tip of a kind of extractive iceberg in Uzbekistan. Cotton farmers are paid way below world prices for their cotton, and so nobody wants to grow cotton, so the government forces you to grow cotton. The family of Karimov, it's a sort of personal dictatorship. It's a very entertaining personal dictatorship. We wrote some blogs about this. Karimov is sort of grooming his daughter to be the next dictator of Uzbekistan, and she recorded an album with Julio Iglesias. So if any of you like Latin pop, you can download that, I think, from YouTube. And she hangs out with Sting and things like that. And she has NGOs and stuff. Anyway, so here's an extractive society, which somehow has a very different set of specific institutions from Zimbabwe, but it has this feature of both being extractive politically and economically. Here's another example, which comes from my own kind of more detailed research about Colombia. So Colombia, and this is again about this interplay between distribution of political power and the state. Who are these guys? These guys are warlords, Colombian warlords. They're four leaders of paramilitary blocs. This is Salvatore Mancuso. This gentleman is called Jorge Quarenta. That's not his real name, but you can see he signs himself George 40. This guy is Don Berna Adolfo Peace, and this guy is called Diego Vecino. So they were warlords. What is this? This is an agreement they signed with politicians, governors of states, mayors, national congressmen, national senators. This agreement called for the refounding of Colombia. What it was really about is getting these warlords to help politicians fix elections in the 2002 election. So in the 2002 election in Colombia, probably a third of the legislature was elected with paramilitary help. Okay? So what's going on here? What's going on here is that the national state in Bogota doesn't control 50% of the territory of the country. Instead, it's people like Jorge Quarenta and Salvatore Mancuso who have armies who control this territory. Okay? And they act just like little states. But this is obviously not a condition, not a circumstance which is going to lead to inclusive economic institutions. Some of these guys are more or less benevolent, but the rough figure is that they expropriated about 5 million hectares of land, probably in the decade before this. You might think, people usually ask me, like, what on earth is this business of, like writing everything down and signing it? If you were English, you'd raise your eyebrow, or something, or you'd shake hands. So perhaps you have to be, like, I think Anglo-Saxons can't really understand this, but one of my Colombian students said to me, the only thing that's really surprising about that is it wasn't notarized. So, this is the only part of the talk where culture comes in. Okay, so these are, I think I should shut up. I should shut up very shortly. So these are, these are very heterogeneous type of situations, so we try to characterize these different regimes, extractive, political, extractive economic institutions, and trying to sort of understand how they interrelate with each other. And then we try to finish the book on a kind of optimistic note. I should show this because this is data from a sociologist. This is from Doug McAdams' work on collective action during the civil rights era. So, again, I guess we emphasize very much, think about the US South. The US South is actually a kind of wonderful example at some level of, some iron law of oligarchy type mechanism, in the sense that after the Civil War, you have the slavery is abolished, black men get the right to vote in the US South. It looks like there ought to be a huge institutional transition, but of course the initial elite managed to reassert control, essentially, over the labour force and over the voting population. By the 1890s, they're passing state constitutions to disenfranchise black people. And one of my favourite sort of papers by the Goran Thurborn, I guess he's a Swedish sociologist, has this wonderful, this was a paper that I found years ago that was very inspiring for Daron and I when we were working on this democracy. He wrote this beautiful survey of the origins, in the New Left Review, the origins of democracy in Europe. And he has this very crude sort of coding of which countries are democratic and when they became democratic. And he codes the United States as only being a democracy after 1965, because before then black people in the South were disenfranchised. But what McAdams data shows is studied was the rise of this is a story about solving the collective action problem. Of course there's an interesting interaction between economic change in this case. For example, the mechanization of cotton picking. The mechanization of cotton picking, migration out of the South maybe changes the costs and benefits of repression for white elites in the South, but it's also very much an example of a political revolution leading to large changes in patterns of discrimination, equality, and economic institutions. Okay, so we use that's again emphasizing this conflict over institutions and political change leading to economic change. And just to end on an optimistic note, we talk at the end about, again, trying to emphasize these transitions and thinking about what could drive change. And Brazil, this is a country where you see a potential for a very different type of a society in Latin America. In the last 20 years, there's been huge expansion in education, falling inequality. And here's Cardoso talking in 1970, Fernando Henrique Cardoso, former sociologist who went on to become very successful president of Brazil. And he's talking in 1973, when I think he's probably in exile in Chile, about what we need to do to get rid of the military. And he's talking about the reactivation of civil society, professional associations, trade unions, the churches, the student organizations, study groups, debating circles, social movements. This is what we call a broad coalition. So we ask, well, in Brazil, there seems to have been this transition. Is that because there really was this broad coalition which kind of vanguarded, in some sense, the transition from extractive political institutions to more inclusive political institutions? So with that, everyone usually accuses me of being desperately pessimistic, so I thought I should end on an optimistic note. So that's... Okay. Now let me say, if you're going to ask me a question, you have to shout loud, because I have this problem with my eardrums. Really, I'm not taking the piss, as I say in England. I have this problem with my eardrums. So you have to shout loud. And you're right at the back, so you really have to yell.
I'll try to shout. So, my wife and I actually read your book on the way we were traveling across country in a Penske truck. And anyway, it was very fascinating. But we recently read Esther Flow's for and we were just curious, in your last chapter, you mentioned how these are like these institutional differences in the background, so any attempt to solve micro-level problems is kind of, in a sense, doomed unless these larger institutional changes are made. But where do poverty traps kind of fit into your framework at all?
Well, so that's a very interesting question. So I would say, Banerjee and I think you have there to float coming and talking in this lecture, Victor.
She did with the, I think it's the economics.
Okay. So they have this sort of model of the world. They kind of say, well, look, politics is important, but there's huge sort of spaces beneath the radar screen where you can do things. And I think that's actually true, by the way. So let me give you one very specific example that they don't talk about, which I know about from personal experience, which is Partners in Health. So I don't know if anyone knows what Partners in Health is, which is this NGO which is it was founded by Paul Farmer and Jim Kim, the new president of the World Bank. So everyone was beating up on Jim Kim, but we were defending him because, what a radical idea. Let's make somebody head of the World Bank who actually has a track record in solving problems for poor people, as opposed to some banker or kind of government bureaucrat. So Partners in Health has an unarticulated political model, and it's as follows. If you go to Haiti was where they first started working. Okay, what Partners Health do, they raise money and they build these amazing state-of-the-art hospitals all over the place. Peru, Haiti, Malawi, Rwanda, Lesotho, all over the world. Okay? So Russia. So what do they do? Where are their hospitals in Haiti? Are they in Port-au-Prince? No. They're all up way out in the Central Plateau. They built this huge teaching hospital in Nyamale, in the middle of nowhere in the Central Plateau. You go to Rwanda. Where are their hospitals in Rwanda? In Kigali? In Gisenyi? No, they're up in these rural areas in the middle of nowhere. So I think that's exactly their strategy. You go to a poor country, healthcare, that's one of the most incredibly valuable, scarce resources. Politicians want to control access to that. They want to decide who gets this, who doesn't get that. So partisan help sort of maneuver their way into a sort of space where they have more autonomy for actually interacting with the community, for sort of depoliticizing the thing. So I agree with that. I think there are spaces like that. I just don't think that's going to change fundamentally the development trajectory of Rwanda or Haiti. I think it does a hell of a lot of good. And I'd be all in favor, that's why I was all in favor of, this grandiose, let's solve, oh dear, we have a president of the World Bank who's not going to solve the problem of development. I mean, who did that? No one did it. I mean, it's not, this comes from, dynamics of institutional political change within societies that I think, like outsiders, it's very difficult for outsiders to influence that. You can think of historical examples where perhaps they did. Like people say in Japan, MacArthur, he broke up the Zaibatsu, he wrote this constitution, they did agrarian reform, But even that, what's the external validity of that experience in Japan? That was a particular society in a particular historical period that sort of, I don't know, there's this embracing defeat thesis that says that, Japan, there was a sort of collective sigh of angst, at the end of the war. And so there was a sort of receptiveness in some sense to construct a different society. So, but generally, we're not in the business of, invading and reforming. And, so I know that in the end of Banerjee and Duflo's book, they take a big swipe at my research. But I'm more sympathetic to that way of thinking about the world, in terms of like doing really something to help people in poor countries than they are to me. Yes.
So you use the word democratic, and sometimes you associate democracy with freedom, and sometimes not.
Yeah.
And so, in terms of, let's say, a democracy would be maybe having a leveling type of income tax program or something like that. They may not be so much promoting growth and development if they're not freedom-oriented.
Yeah. So okay, that's a great question. So let me say two things about that. First, in the book, in the framework, we don't talk about democracy. We talk about inclusive political institutions. Now, you might think, hold on, isn't that the same as democracy? And what we try to do is give examples. So Venezuela would be a great example. So Venezuela, in some sense, is a democracy, but it's a democracy where, 51% of people love President Chavez and 49% of people hate him. And it's a sort of tyranny of 51% over the 49%. So I think, this pluralism here also comes along with some notion of sort of checks and balances, and so that's a democracy of some level, but it's a very dysfunctional democracy. Lots of people with lots of political scientists will tell you Colombia is a democracy, but it has, this feature of half the country being run by warlords. So, national elections take place and presidents come and go, so I think if you think about inclusive societies, in this inclusive bin are, Sweden and the United States, or something. And Sweden has very high tax rates, and a much larger welfare state, more social insurance. Are those high taxes, is that extractive? Does that reduce incentives? I think it almost certainly does. But I guess we would say that both the US and Sweden have this basic property of sort of equality of opportunity, of a well-functioning central state. And within that, there's lots of scope for sort of choosing different systems, which may be important for development. And you may say those things interact. Perhaps Sweden can only be Sweden because the US is the US. Because Sweden free rides on technical change elsewhere in the world or something. But I guess from the point of view of this book, we're going to say these things are all inclusive enough to be in this bin and not in this other bin. Although they differ on these other dimensions, probably for reasons which have nothing to do with this theory. Yes.
Could you, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And isn't that part of what's going on in the extractive institutions? That the English society was happy to be in charge and exploit the Indians that they could have gotten. If they could have.
Yes.
They ran away.
Yes.
But so eventually the only solution was to bring people in and give them some power and so forth. But then Englishmen went to South Africa and for another 150, 200 years created this extractive system there. Similar system was created by Americans in Guatemala and lots of places in Latin America where people settled in the United States and bought the land and extracted the
power corrupt sounds like a more kind of dynamic idea of how, this evolves.
It's the fact that you have power and you can get away with being extractive. It's the ability of somebody to prevent the great power that is able to influence and manipulate governments. There are lots of examples of companies having deals with the elites in a country, or the elites are exploiting their. I mean, it seems that there's what's the thing that prevents except local balance of power within that? Because
I think balance of power is very important.
But how does a country without very much in the way of technology, what's their ability to get Foxconn to come? They're really have no bargaining power. There's 100 other countries or places where somebody could establish a plant, and so a lot of the opportunities.
I know, but one thing that this book it doesn't talk much about. The book talks a lot about historical processes, I guess, of influence of institutions such as colonialism, but it talks much less about more recent phenomena, impact of international finance institutions or foreign capital or the United Fruit Company or the Cold War. And I guess that's just because, I think, that we probably neglect those kind of mechanisms. But I guess in our own research, we've sort of convinced ourselves that it's, there are, of course, these things like colonialism and stuff that are very important. But the internal dynamics of politics and institutions are very important. Just to give you a personal example, or maybe the most important thing, just to give you a personal example, I've interacted an awful lot in the last 10 years with people in the World Bank and things like that in different parts of sub-Saharan Africa. And I've always been unbelievably impressed by how little impact they have on anything. That it's if you want to understand why Sierra Leone is how it is, or the Congo how it is, that's to do with the kind of, today it's to do with the distribution of power and the way the state functions in that society. That itself, of course, is a function of historical processes like colonialism, for example. The Congo wouldn't even exist without colonialism. But it's, once you set that thing in motion, my impression is that, it's not that impacted by these other things. There may be counterexamples to that, like the United Fruit Company in Guatemala, but I guess, that's not in. Perhaps it should be, but it isn't. I hear you. You have questions there.
As a purchase or clarification, what makes something exclusive rather than an inclusive institution is not the outcome per se, it's the legal. It's a society that has property rights, due process, but has massive inequality would be counted by you as.
Yeah, I think that there's a natural connection between inclusiveness and an equal distribution of income. I think if you look around the world today, it's actually the most extractive parts of the world that have much higher levels of inequality. There's some kind of interaction with technology there in some sense. Latin America became
much more unequal when all of this land became valuable, because then the land got expropriated and that exacerbated inequality in the second half of the 19th century. But I would say, the big picture is, even places like the US or Britain have a much more egalitarian distribution of income and assets than Latin America or the south of, of course, there's even more egalitarian societies, with different historical conditions. But I would say, other things equal, and maybe other things aren't equal, maybe you have oil or something else, inclusive societies would tend to have more equal distribution because that's just a natural outcome of this process I described. And to the extent that, the US has become much more unequal in the last 25 years, I guess I would say that's an interaction both of technological change interacting with, political change, political capture of institutions by the financial industry, by political manipulation of politics. So I'm not, some people, my friend Simon Johnson, my co-author Simon Johnson, sort of has this very strong view that the US is now becoming sort of totally oligarchized. In the book, we actually, we didn't write about this in the book. In the book, we take a much more optimistic view about the US, which is, we look historically and we sort of say, look, even in a society with inclusive institutions, there's always challenges to institutions. In the 19th century, it was the Gilded Age, it was the robber barons, it was Rockefeller and Vanderbilt and stuff who were challenging the institutions. But the US responded, and sort of got that under control. They broke up Standard Oil, passed its antitrust laws. It did that through political reform also, by rewriting the constitution, by having direct election of senators, by enfranchising women, by doing lots of other things, which changed the political balance of forces. So we come out sort of optimistic about the US system. You could say the systems, the institutions have proved robust. Think about the 1930s, the attempt by Roosevelt to kind of pack the Supreme Court. That was another example of, how the institutions were being challenged. Some people would say, for a good, Roosevelt came in, he wanted to pass all this New Deal legislation, and the Supreme Court started ruling it unconstitutional. And then Roosevelt said, well, we need to reform the Supreme Court. It's full of old people, they're very tired, they're overworked. Let's say that you can't be a Supreme Court judge if you're over the age of 70. It just so happened that all the judges who were voting against Roosevelt were over the age of 70, coincidentally. But Congress wouldn't go for that. Even though Roosevelt had a big mandate in some sense, and the Democrats had majorities in Congress and the Senate, people wouldn't go for it. So I guess I'm optimistic about. I see the US as I still see the US as a sort of very inclusive, kind of robust political system. And it takes time to adjust to these things. People have only just woken up in the last couple of years to this enormous increase in inequality and what might be going on. So I guess I'm still optimistic. But any system can oligarchize, and we use the example that I like best to use in the book is sort of Venice. Venice was probably the most successful and richest place in the world in the early medieval period, and then it kind of oligarchized and went into reverse. So that can happen to any place, can't it? And even the United States. So. And I'm a British citizen, so I have a completely objective opinion on these matters. Yes, sir.
Before there's the colonial expansion, and colonialism can be a cause on countries elsewhere. Europe is in itself in a process of state formation, right?
Yes.
So I wonder, how do we understand, say, differences between Eastern and Western Europe? I'm not sure, was it, sedentary populations pretty much across the board, right, in East and West, and so, I'm not seeing what,
well, the argument, so I didn't talk about this very much, but in the argument, we tried to sketch this sort of theory of institutional dynamics and institutional divergence at these critical junctures. And I guess the idea we have here, it's very inspired by some of our own kind of scientific work, but also by work by Robert Brenner. I don't know if you're familiar with work by Robert Brenner in the 1970s. That Brenner was studying the emergence of capitalism in Western Europe and why in the late, after the period of the Black Death in the 1340s, Western Europe and Eastern Europe had diverged. And his argument was sort of, this is actually my take on his argument. It's not actually what he says, but it's like, I think it's a sensible interpretation of his argument, which he'd probably strenuously disagree with if he was here. But the Black Death comes, and the Black Death is like a massive shock, discovering the frontier or something. But the shock, the consequences of the shock depends on how it interacts with initial institutional differences. And, what Brennan says is that, if you look at the difference between Western Europe and Eastern Europe, in Western Europe, the lords were weaker. The sort of peasant society was more organized. In the East, it was a sort of frontier expansion. Lords had larger estates. They had more control over their labor force. When the population goes down, there's two mechanisms that go in opposite direction. One is labor becomes much scarcer. So you think that might give people more power. And in fact, if you look at the English case, what happens after the Black Death is the King in England immediately passes a law trying to do something. The first thing is the law freezes wages at the level before the Black Death. And the law also bans enticement of labourers. Meaning, I'm a lord, suddenly 50% of my workers died. I need workers, so I want you to come, from next door. Okay, come and work for me. So that gets made legal, and there's a lot of legal cases like this. So one. You can see there's different things going in different directions. Think of a competitive. This is like the famous Domar thesis about slavery and serfdom. In a competitive labour market, if the labour supply halves, wages will be very high. So Domar argued that, it's when population density is scarce you'd expect to see slavery, because in the absence of labour coercion, wages would be very high. So on the one hand, the bargaining power of, workers goes up because there's this competition for labour. But on the other hand, the incentive of the elites to kind of repress them simultaneously increases. And so the argument is sort of basically in Eastern Europe, the coercion thing wins out, because the lords have relatively more power compared to class power, Brennan would say, compared to the peasants. But in the West, it works out in the other direction. And so, and then feudalism sort of crumbles. So that's a very interesting, it's sort of like saying you have these small differences in institutions and they interact with this shock, and it creates this big divergence in institutions. And so we actually use a very similar argument to look at the impact of the discovery of the Americas on institutions within Europe. That small differences in the way institutions were, in the power of merchants or parliaments or monarchs in this early modern period, had very important consequences for the impact of kind of interoceanic trade expansion on institutional dynamics. So that was a long answer to your question. Yes?
So looking at economic development in Asia, of course, all sorts of comparisons are made between India and China.
Yeah.
I would argue that it's India's history of living under extractive institutions of the British Raj that place it at a significant disadvantage as compared to China, which, for better or worse, has this legacy of collective and cooperative development and planning and so forth. So where do you see these countries going? And do you see a divergence kind of cropping up?
This gentleman's asking me he has a very interesting conjecture about why China is doing better than India, which is to do with the extractive legacy of British colonialism in India. And then he asks, well, how do I see these societies going? As will be obvious if you read the book, most of our academic work has been, sort of mathematical models, cross-national empirical work, and the more detailed sort of work we've done has been in Latin America or Africa. So the part of the book which is about Asia it's much less. That's our view of the world. It is inspired by studying those places. So we try to extend these ideas to talk about Asia and the Asian experience. But I guess I feel on much shakier ground. I mean, I could say something, but I'd feel embarrassed, with a scholar such as yourself. I mean, I said what I said about China. We discuss some examples, like the Meiji Restoration and these institutional dynamics in in Japan, which is again another very interesting example of a sort of political revolution leading to this change in economic institutions, the kind of abolition of feudalism, the creation of a kind of national state in Japan, which hadn't existed before, and we say some things about China, but I'm not sure I know the answer to that question. I mean, one view would be, well, India is going to do better because India has a much more sort of enduring political system. It has a democracy, maybe it's pretty dysfunctional in lots of dimensions, and they moved towards inclusive economic institutions. The political system is more inclusive. This looks more kind of enduring from our point of view. But then if you read Victor's book, you'd know that actually, what's going on in China in terms of how the development of the economy and capitalism has been very inclusive, and it's likely going to lead to a transition to a very different type of political system. I think after I'd read Victor's book, I might backtrack on this view about India. So I think it's very speculative, and as you know, economists are very bad at forecasting anything, so, especially ex-economists like me. Okay. Yes, sir.
Thank you, sir. From Costa Rica, you mentioned Costa
Yes,
Rica.
yes.
You mentioned there was different than other examples.
Yeah.
Right now, inequality is raising, and the political power is controlled by an elite. And given that you bring Cardoso's argument in making a coalition in that positive sense, why would we forecast them?
I don't know. I mean, so I would say the only thing I'd say about Costa Rica is that Costa Rica is the one place in Latin America which in the 19th century passed these laws for the allocation of frontier land, which were similar to this homesteading in the United States. They created this much more egalitarian frontier expansion. And Costa Rica did not have dense population of indigenous people during the colonial period. So you could say this was a very peripheral place in the Spanish colonial empire. It didn't suffer from those very extractive institutions. Perhaps it did suffer from the United Fruit Company, which was heavily involved in Costa Rica. I would say, like, if of course, I don't know, you're an economist, are you?
Yes.
Okay, so the R squared of any theory is not 1. So I would say, like, if you thought about the historical dynamics of Costa Rican society, you could sort of explain how you did get a much more egalitarian distribution of power historically. That's what led to this different type of frontier expansion and early democratization. Costa Rica has been a consolidated democracy, inclusive political system much earlier, but what you're saying is that that's not the whole story. There's other dynamics, and I guess if you took that description at face value, you'd say Costa Rica ought to be much richer than it is. So I just don't know enough about the details of the case to know why that is. Yeah. Uruguay too. Uruguay should be richer than it is according to this theory. So there's lots of sources of variation in history. So, but I'd love to know more.
Well, thank you very much.
Okay,
food upstairs. I'm not entirely sure because originally we had it scheduled the reception at the conference center. We realized it was too difficult to get to that place, and we asked the caterers to move it here. And I'm not sure that.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.